The coordinates on the screen were his own. High Counselor Drakon Ver had read fleet coordinates 10,000 times in his long career. He had never read a set that named his own ships, sent back to him by a hand that was not his. The message had run 14 seconds. It had ended 37 heartbeats ago. He had not moved since. Attached to the transmission was a single image, a photographed page, cracked along the fold. Ink gone brown with age. Handwritten notes crowded the margins beside a column of tight, careful script. It looked like nothing. It looked like everything. The timestamp beneath the coordinates was wrong. Not wrong the way an error is wrong. Wrong the way a door left open is wrong. When you remember locking it yourself. Ver's four wings sat folded flat against his back, the way they always did in session. Tonight they would not settle. Something under the bronze plate of his shoulder kept pulling, a nerve he had not felt since the campaign that killed his brother. He looked at the code name again. Operation Ghost Harvest, classified above his own clearance, and he had approved the funding for it himself. No leak, no breach, no warning from a single one of his intelligence officers. The humans had not stolen the file. They had simply already had it. His communicator sat on the arm of his chair, small and dark. His claw hovered over it. 4 words. He only needed to send 4 words, and the fleet 9 light minutes away would know what he now knew. His hand did not shake. That was the strange part. In 28 cycles of command, his hand had never once shaken, and it did not shake now, at the one moment he almost wished it would. He pressed down. This message ran 14 seconds. It took 211 years to build. Stay close. You're going to want to see how he answers it. 6 hours earlier, the obsidian amphitheater smelled the way it always did before a vote. Ozone from the crystal ceiling vents, and underneath it, the mixed breath of 4,000 species who had never agreed on anything except the shape of this room. The chamber ran 3 kilometers across, carved from a single slab of black volcanic stone, old enough that no one alive remembered the quarry it came from. Above it, a dome of transparent crystal held back the cold light of the Aethelgard Nebula, so that every delegate who looked up saw the same indifferent stars. Drakon Ver had never lost a vote in this chamber. Not once, in a career that had taken 3 planetary systems and cost him a brother. He did not talk about. He believed, the way a person believes the sun will rise, that a species which stayed quiet was a species that had nothing to say. Admiral Vexcor sat 2 tiers below him, second-class noble, a soldier who followed orders and privately doubted everyone he'd been given this year. Elder Thessari, oldest voice in the chamber, closed her eyes rather than watch the vote tally climb. She had spent decades reading records on the subject of silence, and she alone in the room understood that a species can be listening for a very long time before it ever speaks. In the human alcove near the back, Ambassador Soren Kale did not stand. He did not raise a hand. He sat with a chipped ceramic cup of cold tea at his elbow, and on his lap, a leather-bound book with no title on the cover. The book was full of handwritten notes, diagrams, and code. It had been passed from ambassador to ambassador for 211 years, each of them adding a page, none of them ever explaining why. To anyone glancing over, it looked like an old man's private notebook. It was a decryption key. The vote came back 387 to 12. The 12 had read the wrong document. The 387 had not read one at all. Ver rose to deliver the annexation notice himself, wings unfolding halfway, a gesture the Zarvati used only for moments they wanted remembered. Earth's seat on this council, he said, voice like stone dragged across stone, has produced 311 years of silence and 1 vote. We move to end the arrangement. Kale closed the book with 1 finger still marking his page. I'll need a 72-hour response window. Ver's mandible clicked. The closest his species came to a smile. Take your time, he said. It changes nothing. Kale did not answer that. He picked up the tea instead and drank it cold, the way he always did, because he had stopped noticing the temperature 19 years ago. Behind the vote, unseen by anyone in the chamber, a notification reached his cuff. He read it once without expression. The Zarvati Empire had been building toward this exact motion for years, quietly, through a chain of committee votes no one outside high command had ever connected. The fleet behind it was real. It was close. And Earth had not been told a single piece of it until now, from a source that was never supposed to exist. Kale's left hand trembled slightly against the book's spine. Not fear. He had felt fear before, and this was not that. This was restraint, the kind that comes from holding a door shut a little longer than you need to. just to be sure of your grip before you open it. He rose, finally, for the first time in the session. Every delegate who had ignored the human alcove for 3 centuries now watched him do it. 72 hours, he said again, to the chamber this time, not to Ver. You'll have your answer before then. He walked out without waiting for a response. Behind him, Elder Thessery opened her eyes. Kale did not go to his quarters. He went to the annex instead, down through a corridor that smelled of recycled air and old coffee, past windows that showed nothing but the black hull of the station. Elder Thessery found him there before he reached his office. She moved slowly, the way old Thorani moved when they wanted you to know they weren't in a hurry. 72 hours, she said. You already know what you'll do with them. I know what I might do, Kale said. You've never once raised your voice in that chamber. In 3 centuries, no ambassador from your world has raised a voice. She studied him with eyes the color of weak tea. I used to think that was fear. What do you think now? I think I've been reading the wrong species for 200 years. She left without waiting for an answer, the way she always did, and Kale watched her go before continuing down. The archive chamber had no windows at all. It sat behind 3 doors that required 3 separate clearances, and inside, the air hummed faintly, with the sound of 1,000 data drives working at once. Kale did not need clearance. He had built the second door himself, 30 years ago, back when his hair was still dark. 14 levels below the annex, in an office with no windows and 1 chair, Commander Jace Harlow watched the council feed on a cracked monitor and did not blink through the vote count. 39 years old, and he had not set foot on Earth in 8 of them. A photograph sat propped against the monitor's base, his wife smiling in a kitchen he barely remembered the color of, his daughter younger in the photo than she was now, holding a violin half her own size. He touched the photograph once, the way a man touches a doorframe on his way out of a house. Then he opened a channel that had no name, only a number, and said 2 words into it. All of it. Somewhere above him, in a room lit only by screen glow, Dr. Myra Okonkwo looked up from her console like she'd been struck. She was the program's lead cryptolinguist, and she had spent most of her adult life reading a language that was never meant to be read. All of it means all of it, she said, not quite a question. It means all of it, Harlow said. She turned back to her terminal and began pulling files. Not one file, a chain of them, fleet deployment records scattered across years, buried under committee minutes and requisition orders that meant nothing on their own. By the 4th hour, patterns started to surface that even she hadn't expected, funding trails that looped back on themselves, ship registries that didn't match public records. Each file took a minute to surface. She had done this work long enough to know that the meaning was never in any single document. It was in what happened when you laid 1,000 of them side by side. A code name that kept recurring in the margins of unrelated reports like a watermark nobody was supposed to notice. She flagged each inconsistency and kept going, because stopping now would mean explaining to Harlow why she'd stopped. The Covenant had been listening for 2 centuries. Tonight was the first time anyone would find out it had heard anything worth saying. Somewhere in that chain of files, a single entry didn't belong, logged years before the operation it described was ever approved. Kale arrived at the archive chamber's inner door as Okonkwo's first flag came through. He read it standing, the book still under his arm, and for the first time that night something in his face changed. Not surprise. Recognition, the particular stillness of a man watching a shape he'd expected finally take form. Show me the timestamp, he said. Okonkwo pulled it onto the main display, a single logged entry, buried among thousands, dated decades before the operation it referenced had a name. She read the number twice before she trusted it. This can't be right. It's right, Kale said. We've had it for years. We just never had a reason to look at it. Above them, in the amphitheater, Drakon Ver moved through the after-session with the loose confidence of a man who had already won. Admiral Vexcor fell into step beside him in the corridor, wings tucked tight, his voice lower than protocol required. They asked for time, Vexcor said. That's new. They ask because it's their custom. Ver did not slow his pace. A species that has spoken once in 300 years has nothing left to say that will matter. Vexcor said nothing to that, though something in his jaw tightened, the look of an officer who has followed an order he privately doubts. It changes the outcome by nothing, you're certain. I've never lost a vote in that chamber. Ver's mandible clicked, satisfaction dressed as patience. For long enough that the doubt has stopped feeling new, he did not raise it again. Back in the archive chamber, Kale set the book down on the console, open to a page near the back. Its ink faded to brown. His finger traced a line of code written in a hand that wasn't his, an ambassador dead for 60 years, whose name was in no public record anywhere. He wrote this the year the Empire changed its cipher, Kale said mostly to himself. He thought it might matter someday. Okongwo didn't look up from her console. It matters today. Kale allowed himself one small thing then, not quite a smile. More the release of something that had been held a long time. He reached for the communicator on the console's edge and did not pick it up yet. 72 hours, he said quietly. Ver thinks he gave us time to think it over. Didn't he? Kale closed the book. He gave us time to finish reading outside the chamber. Unseen by anyone in it, a status light on the deployment terminal shifted from amber to green, a signal with no name of its own, meaning only that whatever came next was already in motion. Vex Corps broke communication silence himself, 20 minutes before the deadline, without telling anyone why. He stood alone on the observation deck of the flagship, the fleet arrayed behind him in the dark like a held breath, and pulled up the deployment orders he had signed 6 months ago without reading past the summary page. This time he read all of it. His claws left 4 small marks in the console's edge by the time he finished. The codename at the header was one he'd typed himself. The coordinates underneath it were not ones he remembered choosing. Run a verification, he told the officer at the next station. Compare our current position against the original filing. Sir, the filing's sealed. High command clearance only. I have high command clearance. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to.
Run it. Back in the archive chamber, Kale watched the last of Okonkwo's cross-references resolve on the main display, a lattice of dates and file numbers collapsing into a single undeniable shape.
He set the leather book down beside the console, open still to the page with the dead ambassador's handwriting, and for a moment simply looked at it, not reading, just looking, the way a man looks at a door he's about to walk through for the last time. You could still wait, Okonkwo said. Ver gave us until morning. Ver gave himself until morning. Kale reached for the cold tea, found the cup empty, set it down without comment. We finished reading hours ago. Harlow's voice came through the comm, flat and steady. Message is packaged. 14 seconds. Coordinates and codename. Timestamp burned into the header so it can't be stripped in transit. A pause. Once this goes out, there's no version of tomorrow where it didn't happen. I know, Kale said. Say the word. Kale did not say it yet. He crossed to the small window at the chamber's far wall, the only one in the entire archive, installed years ago against every security recommendation, because he'd once told a young cryptolinguist that a person who can't see the sky starts to forget what they're protecting. Outside, the Ethelgard Nebula hung cold and indifferent, the same stars Ver's amphitheater ceiling had shown that morning. He thought briefly about the first ambassador who had started the book. No name survived in any public record. Just a hand and a date, and the first page of code copied from a Zarvathi transmission nobody in the Empire had ever known was read. 211 years of people who never raised their voices. Send it, Kale said. The mundane part came after, not before. Okonkwo closing her console, wiping the same spot on the desk, twice out of habit, the small, useless motion of a hand that needed something to do while history moved without it. The transmission left the station at the speed every council channel allowed, indistinguishable in transit from 1,000 routine diplomatic pings. It reached the amphitheater's relay first, then split outward across 4,000 open channels at once, arriving everywhere in the same instant. Ver's private terminal, Vex Corps' flagship, the public feeds monitored by species who had never once cared what Earth had to say. On the flagship, the verification Vex Corps had ordered returned at the exact moment the message did. Both showed him the same coordinates. He stared at the second display, then the first, then understood there was no longer a meaningful difference between them. A number he hadn't thought about in months returned to him now with a different weight. 76. 76 years since the operation was first proposed, back when he was young enough to believe every order made sense because someone above him had already checked. He opened a channel to the amphitheater. Count Suller, you need to see this. Ver was already seeing it. 37 seconds had passed since the message ended, and he had not moved, had not blinked, had not lowered the claw still hovering above his own communicator. Elder Thessery, watching from the tier below, spoke for the first time since the session had opened that morning. Her voice was quiet, and it carried anyway, the way a held silence carries further than a shout. 214 years, she said, to no one in particular. I have studied what it means for a species to say nothing. I always assumed it meant they had nothing worth saying. No one answered her. No one in the chamber had words ready for what they'd just watched. Ver's wings, folded flat since morning, came loose from his back for the first time in the session. Not the ceremonial half-spread he used for moments he wanted remembered, but a full, involuntary flare, the reflex of a body remembering an old threat before the mind caught up. He looked, one more time, at the timestamp buried in the message's header. 61 years. The number sat there, small and exact, refusing to become anything other than what it was. Somewhere below the amphitheater, unseen, a second signal activated, one that had nothing to do with the message just sent, and everything to do with what Kale had chosen not to include in it. The second signal was not a weapon. It was a courtesy Ver would never learn he'd been given. Below the amphitheater, Harlow watched a single line resolve on his console and let out a breath he hadn't noticed holding. "Fleet withdrawal order," he said into the open channel. Someone on their side just pulled the trigger themselves. Kale, still standing at the small window, did not turn around. "Vex Corps. How did you know?" "I didn't. I hoped." He finally looked away from the stars. "There's a difference, but not much of one tonight. On the flagship, Vex Corps had already signed the order before he let himself think too long about what signing it meant. Around him, officers who had followed Ver without question for years now watched him with the particular stillness of people recalculating who they answered to. He did not explain himself to them. He only said, "Stand down," and then said it again, louder, so no one could claim they hadn't heard. In the amphitheater, Ver had not moved from where the message left him. His wings, still flared from the earlier reflex, would not fold back down no matter how many times his body tried. Around him, the chamber that had never once seen him lose a vote was already dissolving into 43 separate side conversations, none of which he controlled. He looked finally at Kale, still seated in the human alcove as though he had never left it, though everyone in the room now understood he had never really needed to. "You had this the entire time," Ver said. It was not quite a question. "We had pieces of it," Kale said. "For longer than either of us have been alive. Today we only had a reason to put them together. 3 centuries of silence." Ver's voice had lost the stone-grinding certainty it carried that morning. What was left underneath sounded almost young. "I told my council a silent species has nothing worth hearing. You told them what silence meant to you." Kale closed the small gap between them unhurried. "We were never quiet because we had nothing to say. We were quiet because we were still listening." Ver said nothing to that. There was, for the first time in 28 cycles, nothing in his long career that had prepared him for a response. Elder Thessery watched the exchange without a single flicker of surprise. The way a person watches a thing they have quietly expected for 200 years finally arrive. The fleet's withdrawal reached public record within the hour, and with it, the shape of what had almost happened became visible to every species who'd voted 387 to 12 that morning without reading past the summary page. Ver's own assessment, once his proudest document, was pulled apart in public session by delegates who had ignored him for years and now could not stop quoting his own words back at him. He did not defend it. He sat through the dismantling of his own career in near total silence, the same silence he had spent a lifetime mistaking for weakness in someone else. By evening, the council had already begun drafting language for something that had never existed before, a formal classification for a species whose intentions could not be read from behavior alone. Nobody could agree on a name for it yet. Someone suggested, half joking, that it should simply be called the human problem, and no one laughed. Ver requested reassignment before the session closed. It was granted without debate, the fastest unanimous vote the chamber had produced all year. Harlow's daughter called him that night, her face small on the cracked monitor, asking why he sounded different. He told her he'd finished something he'd been working on a long time, and that he'd try to be home before her next recital. He did not tell her what the something was. She did not ask twice. Some things in his family had never needed explaining twice. Okonkwo shut down her console for the first time in 14 hours and discovered her hands were shaking, now that there was finally nothing left that needed them steady. Kale walked back to the archive chamber alone, the corridor quieter now than it had been at any point since morning. He passed Thessery on the way, and she said only, "I have been reading the wrong species for 200 years, and this time he answered her. "You weren't wrong," he said. "You were just early." She almost smiled at that. It was the closest either of them came to celebrating. In the chamber, he set the leather book on the console one last time and opened it to a blank page near the back, the first blank page the book had held in decades. He took a pen from his coat, the same worn pen he had carried for as long as anyone at the annex could remember, and wrote a single line at the top of the page. He did not read it back to himself. He simply closed the book over the fresh ink and let it dry unseen. He thought briefly of the ambassador who had started it, whose name was in no record anywhere, who could never have known that the small, patient thing he began would end in empire's certainty 2 centuries later. He closed the book. The cover was worn smooth at the edges. He thought about the years of handwriting inside, the patience of people who had never raised their voices. He set the book on the table. The silence in the room was the loudest thing he had ever heard. Outside the small window, the stars of the Ethelgard Nebula burned on, indifferent, the same as they had been that morning, the same as they would be tomorrow, whether anyone in that chamber ever learned to read the quiet ones or not.